大家好，我是 Jenny， 欢迎来到沉思者 J。我们今天要认识一位特别的学者，他改变了人们理解历史的方式。他不只记录帝王将相的功业，他更关心文明深处的精神面貌。这个人就是雅各布布克哈特，他被称为文化史研究的奠基者。他让历史学拥有了全新的视野，他也是文艺复兴研究最重要的开拓者。今天我们就走进他的世界，看看他如何重新定义了历史的意义。雅各布布克哈特出生在瑞士巴塞尔，那是1818年的5月。他的家族世代担任牧师，父亲是巴塞尔教会的重要人物。这个家庭充满浓厚的宗教氛围，从小布克哈特就被期待继承家业。他应该成为一名牧师，延续家族悠久的信仰传统。巴塞尔当时是个古老的城市，这里保存着丰富的历史记忆，教堂、图书馆与古老建筑随处可见。这样的环境深深滋养了他的心灵。年幼的布克哈特喜欢阅读历史故事，他对古代世界充满好奇，这份好奇日后成为他毕生的志业。布克哈特进入大学后开始学习神学，这是父亲对他的期望，但他内心始终感到挣扎。神学的教条让他感到束缚，他更渴望探索人类文明的多样面貌。历史与艺术让他感到自由。经过长时间的思考与挣扎，他最终做出了重要的决定。他放弃了成为牧师的道路，转而全心投入历史的研究。这个选择让家人感到失望，但布克哈特坚持自己的信念。他相信理解过去能照亮现在，这个信念支撑他走过艰难的转折，也成为他一生学术的起点。他渴望深造，于是前往柏林求学。柏林大学当时汇聚了欧洲最优秀的学者，他在那里遇见了历史学家兰克。兰克强调历史研究必须严谨考证，学者应该回到原始的史料当中，不能凭空想象历史的面貌。这种严格的训练让布克哈特受益良多，他学会了如何审慎地分析证据，但他逐渐感到单纯考证还不够。他想理解的是时代整体的精神，不只是事件发生的先后顺序，而是人们当时的信念与感受。这份思考为他日后的研究奠定方向。他开始寻找属于自己的历史方法，一条与兰克略有不同的道路。布克哈特完成学业后写下了第一本书，这是他第一本重要的学术著作。书中探讨罗马皇帝君士坦丁的时代，那是古典世界转变为基督教世界的时刻，这是一个关键的历史转折。他描绘了一个文明如何走向彻底的改变。这本书展现了他早期独特的史学眼光，他善于捕捉时代交替之际的氛围与张力。这份功底也为他日后的杰作奠定基础。求学期间，布克哈特第一次前往意大利，那次旅行彻底改变了他的人生。他走访佛罗伦斯与罗马的街道，古老的教堂里藏着动人的壁画，广场上矗立着精致的雕塑作品，每一栋建筑都诉说着古老的故事。布克哈特站在这些作品前，久久不能言语。他感受到的不只是视觉的美丽，他感受到一整个时代的灵魂。文艺复兴时期人们对美的追求，那种追求充满了生命的热情。从那一刻开始，意大利成为他心灵的故乡。他下定决心要深入研究这段历史，要让世人理解这个辉煌时代的真正价值。这份初心伴随他度过了一生。完成学业后，布克哈特回到了巴塞尔，家乡的大学聘请他担任教授职位。他教授历史，也教授艺术史课程。他的课堂总是吸引许多学生。他擅长用生动的方式讲述历史故事。多年后，柏林大学想要聘请他任教，那是当时学术界最顶尖的职位。许多学者终其一生都渴望这个机会，布克哈特却出乎意料地拒绝了邀请。他说自己更适合安静的小城生活。巴塞尔的单纯让他能专心于研究。他不喜欢大城市喧闹的学术竞争，他重视与学生之间真诚的交流。比起显赫的名声，他更看重内心的平静。这个选择展现了他与众不同的人生态度。巴塞尔是一座古老的小型共和城邦，这里崇尚自治与务实的生活态度。布克哈特深爱这种朴实无华的氛围。 他认为小型社群更能保有人性的温度，庞大的帝国容易让个人变得渺小而空虚。他终其一生选择守护这份珍贵的归属感，这也解释了他为何屡次拒绝外的邀请。布克哈特的课堂从不枯燥乏味，他善于用故事带领学生进入历史现场。他鼓励学生亲自阅读原始文献，而不是只记忆教科书上的结论。许多学生形容他的讲课如同艺术之旅，他总是耐心回答学生提出的各种问题。这种教学热情感染了一代又一代的后辈。布克哈特出版了一本重要的艺术指南，书名的意思是向导或解说者。这本书详细介绍意大利各地的艺术作品，从建筑、雕塑到绘画都涵盖其中。他教导读者如何细细欣赏每一件作品，不只是看热闹，而是理解背后的意义。这本书很快受到旅人们的喜爱，许多前往意大利旅行的人都随身带着它。他帮助无数读者打开了艺术的眼睛。这本书展现出独特的写作风格，也呈现出布克哈特细腻的笔触。他善于用平易的语言讲述深刻的道理，这种能力后来成为他最重要的特质。今天许多旅游指南延续了类似的精神，教导旅人不只是打卡拍照，而是用心欣赏。布克哈特当年的用心可以说影响深远，他让后人懂得旅行也可以是一种学习。1860年，布克哈特出版了毕生代表作，书名探讨意大利文艺复兴时期的文化。这本书彻底改变了人们研究历史的方法。他提出国家本身可以被视为艺术作品。当时意大利的城邦由聪明的统治者治理，他们运用精密的计算与策略掌控局势，外交手段被当作一种精致的艺术。这种治理方式充满了理性与创造力。统治者必须随时观察局势，调整策略。布克哈特认为这展现了人类智慧的高峰。这个观点与过去的历史写法不同。过去的历史只单纯描述战争与政治，他看见的是政治背后的思维方式。法国学者米歇勒最早使用这个词汇，布克哈特让这个概念变得更加完整，也让它变得更加立体。他赋予文艺复兴具体的文化内涵，也赋予它鲜明的时代精神。从此，这个词汇成为历史学中重要的概念。许多意大利城邦的统治者都很有智慧，他们各自展现出独特的治理风格。佛罗伦斯的麦德奇家族擅长运用金钱，他们也懂得巧妙运用权力。米兰的统治者精通策略与权谋的运用，威尼斯共和国则发展出精密的政治制度。这些城邦彼此竞争，也彼此学习。统治者聘请学者、艺术家为他们服务，宫廷里聚集了当时最优秀的人才。这种竞争意外促成了文化的蓬勃发展。布克哈特认为这正是文艺复兴迷人之处，权力与美学在这个时代紧密交织在一起。布克哈特书中还谈到个人意识的觉醒。中世纪的人们依附于群体与身份，一个人的价值来自他所属的阶层。到了文艺复兴时期，情况开始改变，人们开始重视自己独特的才华与成就。艺术家不再只是默默无名的工匠，他们开始在作品上留下自己的名字。他们也渴望获得世人的赞赏与记忆。许多人才华洋溢，同时拥有多种专长。画家也可能同时是建筑师或学者。这种全才的典范令后世赞叹不已。布克哈特称这是个人光辉绽放的时代。文艺复兴时期，人们开始书写自己的传记，这在中世纪是相当少见的现象。人们渴望记录下自己独特的生命经历，这种对自我表达的渴望逐渐成为风气。布克哈特认为这标志着一件大事，那就是现代个人意识的诞生。人不再只是某个群体的一部分，每个人都可以成为自己故事的主角。达文西就是这个时代最好的例子。他同时是画家、发明家，也是科学的探索者。建筑师阿伯提同样身兼学者与创作者。这些人物展现出令人惊叹的多重才华。布克哈特赞赏他们是全面发展的人。后人也用文艺复兴人来形容这种典范。这个词汇至今仍被广泛使用着，形容一个人拥有多方面的才能与兴趣。布克哈特的观察让这个概念深植人心。这本书也描写了古典文化的复兴。 学者们重新寻找古希腊罗马的典籍，许多失落已久的手稿被重新发现，人们如饥似渴地研读古代的智慧，古典的语言与思想重新受到重视。学者四处奔走收集古老的文献，图书馆里堆满了珍贵的手抄本。这场复兴运动点燃了求知的热情。布克哈特认为这是文明跃进的关键，古老的智慧为新时代提供了养分。这也呼应了沉思者 J 一直关注的主题，古老的智慧往往能照亮现代的道路。布克哈特也观察到当时信仰的奇特现象，基督教信仰与古老的异教思想并存着，人们一方面虔诚地敬拜上帝，另一方面又着迷于古希腊罗马的神话。这种矛盾没有让人们感到不安，反而激发出丰富而多元的创造力。艺术作品里常常同时出现圣经人物，古希腊神话的角色也经常出现其中。这种融合展现了那个时代开放的精神。布克哈特认为这正是独特的魅力，也是文艺复兴最迷人的地方。布克哈特的研究不只停留在政治与艺术，他也仔细描绘了当时的社会生活。盛大的节庆展现了人们蓬勃的生命力，街头巷尾充满了歌声与欢笑的氛围。他也关注当时女性的角色与地位，许多女性开始参与文艺与学术活动。当时佛罗伦斯的贵族女性开始接受教育，她们学习诗歌语言，甚至参与哲学讨论。这在当时的欧洲是相当前卫的现象。布克哈特特别赞赏这种开放的风气，他认为女性的参与让社交生活更加丰富，这也展现了文艺复兴多元而包容的一面。社会阶层之间的界限也逐渐模糊，富商与贵族时常一同出席宴会，这些细节让历史变得鲜活而立体。布克哈特相信日常生活同样值得记录，伟大的时代不只由帝王将相构成，平凡人们的生活同样塑造了文明的面貌。布克哈特的研究方法也十分独特，他不采用一条直线式的历史叙事，他喜欢用横切面的方式观察时代，同时检视政治、信仰与文化三个层面。他反对当时流行的历史哲学观念，许多学者相信历史正朝着进步前进。当时哲学家黑格尔提出一套理论，他认为历史正朝着理性前进，许多学者深受这套宏大理论的吸引。布克哈特却保持着谨慎而清醒的态度，他认为历史充满了偶然与矛盾，不该被简化成一套完美无缺的公式。这种怀疑精神成为他学术人格的核心。布克哈特对这种乐观想法十分怀疑，他认为历史并没有预定的方向，每个时代都有自己独特的价值与困境。这种谨慎的态度让他的研究更加深刻。他教导学生要谦逊地面对历史的复杂，不要轻易用简单的理论概括一切。1870年欧洲爆发了普法战争，这场战争让布克哈特感到强烈的不安，他开始担心欧洲文明可能走向毁灭。正是在这样的时代背景下，他开设了讲座。他想提醒世人珍惜眼前的文明成果，不要被一时的权力欲望冲昏了头脑。这份忧虑成为他晚年思想的核心，也让他的讲座格外充满紧迫的力量。布克哈特晚年开设了一系列重要讲座，这些讲座后来集结成书，广为流传。书中他展现了对未来的深沉忧虑，他观察到群众的力量正在迅速壮大，他担心民主可能被野心家轻易操弄，他预言将会出现可怕的简化者。这些人物擅长用简单口号煽动群众，他们会牺牲自由换取虚假的秩序。布克哈特用简化者来形容一种危险人物，这些人会把复杂的问题简化成单一答案，他们承诺用激烈手段解决所有的不满。群众在面对不安时容易被这种承诺吸引。布克哈特认为文明的进步其实非常脆弱，一旦理性的讨论被简单的口号取代，社会就可能滑向暴力与专制的深渊。他的这番分析在当时显得相当超前，布克哈特的警告在当时显得格外突出，许多人并不理解他忧虑的深意。然而20世纪的历史证明了他的洞见，残暴的独裁政权真实的降临在欧洲大的，人们这才惊讶地回头审视他的预言。在巴塞尔任教期间，布克哈特结识了尼采，尼采当时也在同一所大学教授语言学。 两位学者经常往来交流彼此的想法。尼采非常敬重布克哈特渊博的学识，他甚至特地前往聆听布克哈特的讲座。布克哈特对历史的见解深深启发了尼采，尼采后来的思想也带有这份影响的痕迹。不过布克哈特始终保持着谨慎的距离，他不愿意卷入尼采激烈而张狂的论战。两人的友谊建立在彼此尊重的基础上，这段情谊也成为学术史上动人的篇章。布克哈特终身未曾结婚，也没有子女，他过着简朴而规律的生活方式，每天的时间都安排得井然有序。教学、写作与散步构成了他的日常，许多荣誉与头衔纷纷找上门来，布克哈特却一一谦虚地推辞了。他始终称自己只是一名普通的学者，他不在乎显赫的名声与地位，他更珍惜内心的平静与专注。这份谦逊让他在学生心中格外受人敬重。布克哈特喜欢每天沿着莱茵河散步，他常常一边散步一边构思讲稿的内容。他的三餐十分简单，从不追求奢华。闲暇时他喜欢弹奏钢琴，聆听乐曲。这些简单的习惯陪伴他度过漫长岁月，也陪伴他完成了学术的生涯。布克哈特开创了文化史这个全新领域，他让历史学拥有了更宽广的视野。历史不再只是政治与战争的记录，信仰、艺术与日常生活同样值得书写。后来的艺术史学者沃夫林深受他的启发，沃夫林也承袭了他的研究方法。他们延续用文化视角观察时代的精神。荷兰历史学家赫伊金哈深受他的启发，赫伊金哈延续了用文化视角解读时代。他们共同开创了文化史这个传统，这是一个重要的学术传统。这个传统影响了20世纪众多历史学者，许多人开始关注艺术与信仰的细节，日常生活的细节也受到重视，而不只是聚焦在政治权力的更迭。更多历史学者受到他启发，投入这个领域。他的著作至今仍是学术界重要的经典，许多大学的课程依然引用他的观点。布克哈特证明了历史可以充满温度，历史同样可以充满想象力。布克哈特的著作后来被翻译成多种语言，世界各地的学生都研读他的研究。巴塞尔大学至今仍以他的研究传统为荣，城市里也有纪念他学术贡献的场所。这些记忆诉说着一位学者的坚持，也诉说着他毕生的热情。今天重新阅读布克哈特依然令人深思。我们身处资讯爆炸的时代，群众的声量也比过去更加高涨。简单的口号依然容易煽动大众的情绪，他对简化者的警告仿佛就在说现在。这提醒我们要保持独立思考的能力，不要轻易被表面的喧嚣带着走。真正的智慧需要耐心观察与深刻理解，这正是布克哈特留给我们最宝贵的礼物。1897年，布克哈特在巴塞尔安详离世，他留下的著作持续影响着后世的学者。他教会我们用更广阔的眼光看待世界。真正的历史往往藏在文化的细节里头。一座城邦的精神可以透过艺术展现出来，一个时代的灵魂可以透过生活方式呈现。布克哈特提醒我们一件重要的事：历史不只是事件的堆叠而已，历史更是人类精神不断探索的过程。这份洞见跨越了时间，依然深刻动人，也呼应了沉思者 J 一直追求的核心精神。我们相信看见本质比看见表面更加重要。今天的故事就到这里，希望布克哈特的智慧能带给你新的启发。我们下次见咯。Hello everyone, I am Jenny. Welcome to Thinker J. Today we are going to meet a scholar who changed the way an entire discipline thinks about the past. He did not spend his career chronicling the marches of armies or the schemes of kings. He cared about something deeper and harder to capture, the inner spirit of an entire civilization. His name was Jacob Burckhardt, and he is remembered today as the founder of cultural history and as the single most important pioneer of Renaissance studies. Before he came along, history was mostly written as a story of battles, treaties, and the rise and fall of rulers. Burckhardt asked a different question. He wanted to know what people actually believed, what they valued, how they lived, and how art, religion, and society fit together to form the character of an age. That single shift in perspective opened a door that historians have been walking through ever since. So let us step into his world and discover how one quiet professor from a small Swiss city reshaped our understanding of history itself. It helps to understand the intellectual climate into which Burckhardt was born. The 19th century was an age in which history was becoming a serious academic discipline for the first time, complete with university chairs, professional journals, and rigorous standards of evidence. At the same time, many thinkers across Europe were drawn to grand philosophical systems that tried to explain the entire sweep of human history according to a single underlying law, whether that law was framed in terms of reason, progress, race, or national destiny. Against this backdrop, a scholar who insisted on patient attention to culture, art, and the texture of daily life, rather than sweeping universal theories, stood out as something genuinely unusual. Burckhardt belonged to this era, yet he never fully belonged to its dominant intellectual fashions, and that quiet independence is part of what makes his work feel surprisingly fresh even now. Several earlier thinkers had already gestured toward a broader history of civilization rather than a narrow chronicle of rulers. The French writer Voltaire had written about the customs and habits of nations, and the English historian Edward Gibbon had traced the slow decline of an entire empire rather than simply listing its emperors. Yet these earlier efforts still tended to organize themselves around politics, religion, or the rise and fall of states as the central thread. Burckhardt pushed further still. He wanted culture itself, the art, the festivals, the inner consciousness of ordinary people, to stand at the very center of the story, not merely as decoration around a political narrative but as the true substance of an age. This was a subtle yet decisive shift, and it would eventually open an entirely new branch of historical study. Jacob Burckhardt was born in the city of Basel in Switzerland, in May of the year 1818. His family had served as pastors for generations, and his father held an important position within the Basel church. The household was steeped in religious tradition, and as the eldest son, he was expected to follow the family calling and become a clergyman himself. Basel at the time was an old and dignified city, full of churches, libraries, and buildings that seemed to whisper centuries of accumulated memory. The city sat along the Rhine River, where merchants, scholars, and travelers from France and Germany all passed through, giving Basel a quiet cosmopolitan flavor despite its modest size. Growing up surrounded by this atmosphere nourished something in the young Burckhardt. He loved reading historical stories from an early age, and he was endlessly curious about the ancient world. That early curiosity would eventually grow into the great calling of his entire life, even though the path toward it was not straightforward. When he entered university, Burckhardt began, as expected, to study theology. This was the hope his father held for him, and for a time he tried to follow it faithfully. But something inside him kept resisting. The rigid doctrines of theological study felt confining to a young mind that was hungry for something broader, something that could embrace the full richness of human civilization in all its variety. History and art gave him a sense of freedom that theology could not. After a long period of inner struggle, he made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He set aside the path toward the clergy and devoted himself completely to the study of history. This choice disappointed his family, yet Burckhardt held firm to his conviction that understanding the past could illuminate the present in ways that doctrine alone could not. That conviction carried him through a difficult transition and became the true starting point of his academic life. Eager to deepen his education, Burckhardt traveled to Berlin to continue his studies. Berlin at that time had gathered some of the finest scholars in all of Europe, and it was there that he encountered the great historian Leopold von Ranke. Ranke was famous for insisting that historians must return to original sources and verify every claim with rigorous evidence, rather than simply imagining what the past might have looked like. He famously argued that the task of the historian was to describe the past as it actually happened, without forcing it into some grand philosophical scheme imposed from above. This discipline left a permanent mark on Burckhardt, teaching him to weigh evidence carefully and to distrust easy generalizations. Yet over time he began to feel that careful verification of facts alone was not enough. What he truly wanted to understand was the overall spirit of an age, not merely the sequence in which events occurred, but the beliefs and feelings that animated the people who lived through them. This realization gave direction to his future research, and he began searching for a historical method that was distinctly his own, one that diverged in important ways from the path Ranke had laid out before him. Where Ranke focused on the precise reconstruction of political events, Burckhardt wanted to reconstruct something far less tangible, the mood and worldview of an entire civilization. Ranke had built around himself an entire school of disciplined, source-based research, sometimes remembered today as historicism, and many of his followers concentrated almost exclusively on diplomacy, treaties, and the inner workings of governments. This approach produced extraordinarily precise studies of political events, yet it left out enormous portions of human experience, the paintings people hung in their homes, the songs they sang at festivals, the unspoken assumptions that shaped how they understood their own lives. Burckhardt did not reject the discipline of his teacher. He simply asked it to widen its gaze. He wanted a history that could account for a peasant festival as carefully as a peace treaty, and for a fresco as carefully as a royal decree. After completing his studies, Burckhardt wrote his first major book. It examined the era of the Roman Emperor Constantine the Great, a pivotal moment when the classical world was transforming into a Christian one. He was fascinated by what he called periods of crisis, moments when an old order was crumbling and a new one had not yet fully taken shape. The age of Constantine was exactly such a moment, an old pagan empire giving way to a new Christian order, with temples falling silent even as soaring new churches rose in their place, and with the founding of a glittering new capital that would one day be called Constantinople. In this early work he was already showing the qualities that would define his mature scholarship, an ability to capture the atmosphere and tension of a civilization at the moment of profound change. This idea of the historical crisis, a turning point when accumulated pressures suddenly reshape an entire era, would stay with him throughout his career and resurface powerfully decades later in his reflections on the future of Europe. He would later see comparable signs of crisis in the wars that unified Germany and in the rising tide of mass politics across the whole of Europe, recognizing in his own century an echo of the upheaval that had once transformed the world of Constantine. This foundation would later support the masterpiece for which he is best remembered. It was during his student years that Burckhardt made his first journey to Italy, and that trip changed the entire course of his life. He walked the streets of Florence and Rome, stepping into ancient churches that held breathtaking frescoes and standing before exquisite sculptures in sunlit piazzas. He climbed the steps of grand cathedrals, wandered through quiet cloisters, and lingered for hours in galleries filled with paintings centuries old. He rose early to catch the soft morning light falling across old stone facades, and he often stayed out until dusk, watching the colors of a piazza shift as the sun moved across the sky. Every building seemed to whisper an old story. Burckhardt stood before these works of art and found himself unable to speak for a long time. What moved him was not simply visual beauty. He felt that he was encountering the soul of an entire era, the passionate pursuit of beauty that defined the Renaissance and the vitality of life that ran through it. From that moment on, Italy became a spiritual homeland for him. He resolved to dedicate himself to understanding this period deeply, so that the world might come to appreciate the true value of this magnificent age. That early passion stayed with him for the rest of his life, drawing him back to Italy again and again over the decades that followed. After finishing his education, Burckhardt returned to Basel, and the university in his hometown offered him a professorship. He taught both history and art history, and his classes consistently drew large numbers of students who were captivated by his vivid storytelling. Years later, the prestigious University of Berlin sought to recruit him, an offer that countless scholars would have spent their entire careers hoping for. To the surprise of nearly everyone who knew him, Burckhardt turned it down. He explained that he was simply better suited to the quiet life of a small city. The simplicity of Basel allowed him to concentrate fully on his research, and he had little taste for the noisy academic competition of a major metropolis. He valued sincere connection with his students far more than he valued prestige, and he cared more about inner peace than about a glittering reputation. This decision revealed a character quite unlike that of many of his ambitious contemporaries, who would have leapt at the chance to move to the capital of a unifying German nation. Basel itself was an old and modest republic, a city that prized self-governance and a practical, unpretentious way of life. Burckhardt deeply loved this unadorned atmosphere. He believed that smaller communities preserved a warmth and humanity that vast empires tended to crush, leaving individuals feeling small and hollow within them. This was no small concern in his lifetime, since across Europe the 19th century was an age of expanding nation-states, growing armies, and rising nationalist fervor. Burckhardt watched these developments with unease, sensing that something valuable was being lost as small, intimate communities gave way to enormous centralized powers. Throughout his life he chose to protect this precious sense of belonging, and this preference explains why he repeatedly declined invitations to leave for more famous institutions elsewhere. In the lecture hall, Burckhardt was never dull. He had a gift for using narrative to bring his students directly into the historical scene, and he encouraged them to read primary sources for themselves rather than simply memorizing conclusions from textbooks. Many of his students later described his lectures as something closer to an artistic journey than an ordinary class. He was endlessly patient in answering questions, and this teaching passion left a lasting impression that was carried forward by generation after generation of students who passed through his classroom. Burckhardt held an unusual habit regarding his own lectures. At the end of each course, he would ask his students to return the notes they had taken, and he never prepared his more reflective lecture series for publication during his own lifetime. He worried that ideas offered as tentative, evolving reflections might calcify into a rigid system once printed permanently on a page, and he preferred that his students carry away a living habit of thought rather than a fixed doctrine to be quoted and defended. This modest reluctance meant that some of his most far-reaching insights would not reach a wider public until long after his death. Burckhardt published an important guidebook to Italian art, whose title translates roughly to guide, or cicerone, meaning someone who explains things to a traveler. The book offered a detailed introduction to artworks found throughout Italy, covering architecture, sculpture, and painting. Rather than simply listing famous sites, Burckhardt taught readers how to look closely at each work and understand the meaning behind it, not merely to glance at it in passing. The book quickly became beloved among travelers, and countless visitors to Italy carried it with them as an essential companion on their journeys through Florence, Venice, and Rome. It opened the eyes of innumerable readers to the deeper layers of artistic meaning around them. The work also revealed the distinctive writing style of Burckhardt, a gift for expressing profound ideas in plain, accessible language, a quality that would become one of his most defining traits as a writer. In many ways, modern travel guides continue a similar spirit today, teaching travelers to look beyond a quick photograph and truly engage with what they are seeing. The careful attention Burckhardt brought to this small guidebook all those years ago left a legacy that still shapes how people are taught to experience art while traveling, helping later generations understand that travel itself could be a genuine form of learning rather than mere sightseeing. In the year 1860, Burckhardt published the work that would define his legacy for all time, a study of the culture of the Italian Renaissance. This book completely transformed the methods historians used to study the past. In it, he proposed a radical idea, that the state itself could be regarded as a work of art. The Italian city-states of the period were governed by remarkably shrewd rulers who used calculation and strategy to control the political landscape around them. Diplomacy itself was treated almost as a refined art form, and this style of governance was filled with rationality and creativity. A ruler had to constantly observe shifting circumstances and adjust strategy accordingly, much in the manner that a contemporary writer named Machiavelli would later describe in his own famous treatise on political power. Burckhardt believed this represented one of the great peaks of human ingenuity, and his perspective differed sharply from older histories that simply narrated wars and political maneuvering one after another. What he saw was the underlying mode of thought behind the politics, not merely the events themselves. It is worth noting that the term Renaissance itself was first popularized by the French scholar Jules Michelet. Burckhardt took the concept and gave it far greater completeness and depth, filling it with concrete cultural substance and a vivid sense of the spirit of the age. From that point forward, the term became one of the central concepts within the entire discipline of history, a label that students around the world still use today without realizing how much careful thought went into shaping its modern meaning. The book itself was organized in a way that felt almost architectural, divided into several distinct sections that together formed a complete portrait of an age. One section explored the state as a work of art, examining how political power was exercised with calculation and style. Another turned to the development of the individual, tracing how personal identity and ambition came to the surface of cultural life. A further section examined the revival of antiquity, while another considered the broader relationship between this new culture and the wider world, including travel, science, and discovery. Two final sections looked closely at the texture of society itself, from the etiquette of court life to the festive spectacle of public celebration, and at the religious and moral life of the period. Read together, these sections did not tell a simple chronological story. Instead, they offered something closer to a series of carefully composed portraits, each illuminating a different facet of the same remarkable century. Many of the rulers across the Italian city-states displayed this same kind of political intelligence, each in their own distinctive style of governance. The Medici family of Florence was especially skilled at wielding wealth, and they understood equally well how to wield power with subtlety, often working behind the scenes rather than through open displays of force. The Sforza family in Milan were masters of strategy and political maneuvering, while the Republic of Venice developed an unusually sophisticated system of governance built around councils and careful checks on individual ambition. Even the notorious Borgia family, often remembered for ruthless tactics, fit into this picture of calculated political art, where survival depended on cunning as much as on military strength. These city-states competed fiercely with one another, yet they also learned from each other in the process. Rulers competed to employ the finest scholars and artists, and their courts gathered the most talented individuals of the era. A prince might commission a chapel from one master while a rival prince raced to commission an even grander one from another, and ambassadors sent home detailed reports describing the paintings and sculptures they had seen, spreading admiration and envy from court to court. Patronage became a form of competition in its own right, almost as fiercely contested as territory or trade routes. This rivalry inadvertently sparked an extraordinary flourishing of culture. Burckhardt believed this was precisely what made the Renaissance so fascinating, an age in which power and aesthetics were tightly woven together. The book by Burckhardt also explored the awakening of individual consciousness during this period. In the medieval world, the value of a person had largely depended on the group or social rank they belonged to. By the time of the Renaissance, this began to change. People started to take pride in their own unique talents and achievements. Artists were no longer anonymous craftsmen working in obscurity. They began signing their names to their works, and they longed to be remembered and admired by the wider world. Many individuals possessed extraordinary talent across multiple fields at once. A painter might equally be an accomplished architect or a learned scholar. Burckhardt described this as an age in which individual brilliance was finally allowed to blossom fully into the light. This was also the period in which people began writing autobiographies about their own lives, something that had been quite rare during the medieval era. People longed to record their own unique experiences, and this desire for self-expression gradually became a defining trend of the time. Burckhardt considered this to be a marker of something enormously significant, the birth of modern individual consciousness. A person was no longer simply a fragment of some larger group identity. Each individual could become the protagonist of their very own story, a narrator of their own life rather than merely a passive participant in a story written by others. Leonardo da Vinci stands as the finest example of the spirit of this era. He was simultaneously a painter, an inventor, and a tireless explorer of scientific questions, sketching flying machines and studying human anatomy with the same intensity he brought to his paintings. The architect Leon Battista Alberti was likewise both a scholar and a creator, writing influential treatises while also designing buildings of lasting beauty. Michelangelo too embodied the same restless versatility, moving between sculpture, painting, and architecture with apparent ease. These figures displayed an astonishing breadth of talent, and Burckhardt praised them as fully developed human beings in the truest sense. Later generations would coin the phrase Renaissance man to describe exactly this kind of ideal, a term still widely used today to describe someone with talents and interests spanning many different fields. It was the careful observation of Burckhardt that helped plant this concept so firmly into our collective imagination. The book also described the revival of classical antiquity during this period. Scholars searched eagerly for ancient Greek and Roman texts, and many long-lost manuscripts were rediscovered after centuries of obscurity. Figures such as the poet Petrarch and the manuscript hunter Poggio Bracciolini traveled to remote monasteries, sometimes finding crumbling copies of ancient works tucked away on forgotten shelves. People studied the wisdom of the ancient world with an almost insatiable hunger, and classical language and thought were once again held in the highest esteem. Scholars traveled far and wide collecting old documents, and libraries filled up with precious handwritten manuscripts. The invention of the printing press during this same period multiplied the reach of this revival enormously, allowing texts that had once existed in only a single fragile copy to be reproduced by the hundreds and carried into classrooms and private studies across the whole of Europe. This revival ignited a passionate thirst for knowledge across the continent. Burckhardt considered it the key turning point that propelled civilization forward, since the wisdom of the ancients provided rich nourishment for an entirely new era. This theme resonates with something thinker Jay has always cared deeply about, the idea that ancient wisdom can still illuminate the path forward in our own time. Burckhardt also noticed something rather curious about the religious life of the era. Christian faith coexisted alongside ancient pagan ideas in a way that seems contradictory at first glance. People devoutly worshipped God on one hand, while remaining utterly enchanted by the myths of ancient Greece and Rome on the other. Rather than causing anxiety or discomfort, this apparent contradiction sparked rich and diverse creativity. Artworks frequently featured biblical figures alongside characters drawn straight from classical mythology, often within the very same composition. A fresco might place a Greek god and a Christian saint almost side by side. This blending revealed the open and exploratory spirit of the age, and Burckhardt considered it to be one of the truly distinctive charms of the Renaissance, a willingness to hold seemingly opposing traditions together without feeling the need to resolve every contradiction. The research conducted by Burckhardt did not stop at politics and art. He also carefully portrayed the social life of the period. Grand festivals displayed the vibrant energy of the people, and the streets filled with song and laughter during seasons of carnival and public celebration. Processions wound through city squares, and elaborate pageants reenacted scenes from history and mythology for crowds of delighted onlookers. He paid close attention to the role and status of women as well, noting that many women began participating actively in literary and intellectual life. Aristocratic women in Florence, for instance, began receiving education, studying poetry and language, and even taking part in philosophical discussions, a remarkably progressive development for Europe at that time. Burckhardt particularly admired this openness, believing that the participation of women enriched social life considerably and reflected the diverse, inclusive character of the Renaissance more broadly. The boundaries between social classes also grew increasingly blurred, with wealthy merchants and aristocrats frequently mingling at the same banquets and civic celebrations. Fashion itself became a quiet language of status and taste, with elaborate fabrics and carefully chosen colors signaling wealth and refinement at a glance, and even the manner in which a host arranged a banquet table or planned an evening of music and conversation was treated as a small art form in its own right. These small details made history feel vivid and three-dimensional rather than abstract. Burckhardt believed that everyday life deserved careful documentation just as much as grand events did, since great eras are never built solely by kings and generals. The lives of ordinary people shape the character of a civilization just as profoundly. The method of research used by Burckhardt was also strikingly distinctive. Rather than telling a single, linear narrative, he preferred to take cross-sectional slices through an era, examining politics, religion, and culture simultaneously rather than chronologically, much as a geologist might examine the different layers visible in a single cut through rock. He pushed back firmly against the popular historical philosophies of his day. Many scholars at the time believed in the inevitable forward march of history toward progress. The philosopher Hegel, in particular, had proposed a grand theory in which history advanced steadily toward reason and freedom. Many intellectuals were captivated by this sweeping framework. Burckhardt remained cautiously skeptical of such optimism. He believed that history was full of accident and contradiction, and should never be reduced to a single, flawless formula. This skeptical instinct became the very core of his intellectual character. He believed history had no predetermined direction, that every era carried its own unique values and its own particular struggles, and this careful, humble attitude made his scholarship considerably more nuanced. He taught his students to approach the complexity of history with genuine humility, rather than collapsing everything into convenient theories that promised to explain everything at once. This skepticism also set Burckhardt apart from an older Enlightenment confidence that reason was everywhere fundamentally the same, and that every civilization could be measured along a single scale leading toward an ideal of universal progress. Burckhardt was far more interested in what made each age distinct and irreducible. He did not believe that the Renaissance was simply a rung on a ladder leading up toward his own 19th century. He saw it instead as a complete world in itself, with its own logic, its own beauty, and its own unresolved tensions, deserving to be understood on its own terms rather than judged by the standards of a later century that happened to come after it. In the year 1870, war broke out across Europe between France and Prussia, and the conflict left Burckhardt deeply uneasy. He began to fear that European civilization itself might be sliding toward catastrophe, watching with alarm as nationalist fervor and military ambition swept across the continent he loved. It was against this anxious backdrop that he delivered a series of lectures intended to remind people to cherish the civilization they had inherited, and not to let momentary lust for power cloud their judgment. This concern became the central theme of his thinking in his later years, and it gave his lectures an unusually urgent and powerful intensity. In his later years, Burckhardt delivered an important series of lectures that were eventually compiled and published as a book on reflections on history. These lectures were never prepared by Burckhardt himself for publication. It was only after his death that a devoted student gathered the surviving notes and shaped them into the book now known as Reflections on History, fulfilling a project that Burckhardt, true to his lifelong caution about fixing his thought into permanent form, had never undertaken on his own. In it, he expressed profound concern about the direction the future might take. He observed that the power of the masses was rapidly growing, and he worried that democracy itself could easily be manipulated by ambitious opportunists. He predicted the rise of figures he called terrible simplifiers, men who would use crude slogans to stir up the masses and sacrifice genuine freedom in exchange for a false sense of order. Burckhardt used this term, the terrible simplifier, to describe an especially dangerous kind of figure. Such people reduce complicated problems down to a single simple answer, and they promise to solve every grievance through forceful, drastic measures. When people feel anxious and unsettled, they become particularly susceptible to such promises. Burckhardt believed that the progress of civilization was actually far more fragile than most people assumed. Once rational discussion is replaced by simplistic slogans, society can slide rapidly toward violence and tyranny. This analysis was remarkably ahead of its time, anticipating dangers that would not become fully visible until decades after his death. The warnings of Burckhardt stood out as unusually striking at the time he gave them, and many of his contemporaries did not fully grasp the depth of his concern. Yet the history of the 20th century would go on to prove his insight correct. Brutal dictatorial regimes truly did descend upon the European continent within decades of his passing, and people would later look back at his predictions with genuine astonishment, wondering how a quiet professor in a small Swiss city had seen so clearly into the dangers lying ahead. During his years teaching in Basel, Burckhardt became acquainted with Friedrich Nietzsche, who taught philology at the very same university. The two scholars exchanged ideas frequently, walking together through the city and discussing history, art, and the future of European culture. Nietzsche held tremendous respect for the vast learning of Burckhardt, going so far as to attend his lectures whenever he could, and he later described those lectures as among the most valuable intellectual experiences of his time in Basel. The historical insights of Burckhardt deeply influenced the thinking of Nietzsche, and traces of that influence can be found throughout the later work of the younger philosopher. Burckhardt, for his part, always maintained a careful distance, unwilling to be drawn into the fierce, sweeping intellectual battles that Nietzsche so often waged against the conventions of his era. Burckhardt preferred caution and nuance, while Nietzsche increasingly leaned toward dramatic, sweeping pronouncements about culture and morality. Despite this difference in temperament, their friendship rested on a foundation of mutual respect, and it remains one of the more touching chapters in the history of 19th-century scholarship. Burckhardt never married and never had children of his own. He lived a simple, disciplined life, with his days carefully organized around teaching, writing, and long walks. Many honors and titles were offered to him over the years, yet he modestly declined them, one after another. He always referred to himself simply as an ordinary scholar, indifferent to fame or status, treasuring instead his inner calm and his ability to focus fully on his work. This humility earned him enormous respect among his students, many of whom went on to become important historians and art historians in their own right. Burckhardt loved to take a daily walk along the banks of the Rhine, often using that quiet time to think through the contents of his next lecture. His meals were simple, never extravagant, and in his leisure hours he enjoyed playing the piano and listening to music, drawing comfort from the structure and beauty of a well-composed piece. These small, unassuming habits accompanied him through the long course of an extraordinarily productive scholarly career, one that spanned more than 4 decades of steady teaching and writing in the same beloved city. His personal quarters in Basel were modest, filled mostly with books and a small collection of prints and engravings rather than any display of wealth. Visitors who met him were often surprised that a scholar of such enormous influence lived so plainly, content with a quiet room, a familiar walk along the river, and the company of a few close friends. He kept up a long correspondence with former students and fellow scholars across Europe, and these letters, many of which survive today, reveal a warm and often playful personality beneath his famously cautious public reserve. Burckhardt single-handedly opened up an entirely new field, cultural history, giving the discipline of history a far broader horizon than it had ever possessed before. History was no longer simply a record of politics and warfare. Faith, art, and the texture of everyday life all became equally worthy subjects of serious study. The art historian Heinrich Wölfflin, who came after him, was deeply inspired by his approach and carried forward his methods, continuing to interpret the spirit of an age through close formal analysis of art and architecture. The Dutch historian Johan Huizinga was likewise profoundly influenced by Burckhardt, extending the practice of reading an era through its culture into his own celebrated studies of the late medieval period. Together, these scholars helped establish cultural history as a major and lasting academic tradition, one that shaped countless historians throughout the 20th century. More and more scholars began paying close attention to the details of art, belief, and daily life, rather than focusing exclusively on the shifting fortunes of political power. Museums today that organize exhibitions around the daily life and worldview of a period, rather than simply around famous names and dates, are quietly continuing a tradition that traces directly back to the patient curiosity of Burckhardt. Many historians who came after Burckhardt were inspired to enter this very field he had helped establish. His work remains a cornerstone text within academia even today, and university courses around the world continue to draw upon his ideas. Burckhardt proved, through his own scholarship, that history could be filled with warmth as much as with imagination, a discipline capable of moving readers as deeply as a great novel while still remaining grounded in careful evidence. The writings of Burckhardt have since been translated into numerous languages, and students around the world continue to study his analysis of the Renaissance. The University of Basel remains proud of the scholarly tradition he established, and the city itself preserves places that commemorate his academic legacy. These lingering traces continue to tell the story of the persistence of one scholar and his lifelong passion for understanding the past, a passion that never required grand titles or distant capitals to sustain it. Reading Burckhardt again today still gives us a great deal to think about. We live in an age of information overload, where the volume of public opinion has grown louder than ever before. Simple slogans remain just as capable of stirring up strong emotion in crowds as they ever were, spreading now at a speed Burckhardt himself could never have imagined. His warning about terrible simplifiers feels almost as though it were written about our own moment. It reminds us to preserve our capacity for independent thought, and not to be swept along by surface-level noise. Genuine wisdom requires patient observation and deep understanding, and that may be the most valuable gift Burckhardt has left for us, a quiet invitation to slow down and look closely at what lies beneath the surface of events. Jacob Burckhardt passed away peacefully in Basel in the year 1897. The work he left behind continues to shape scholars to this day. He taught us to view the world through a far wider lens, reminding us that the true substance of history often hides within the smallest cultural details. The spirit of a city-state can be expressed through its art, and the soul of an era can be expressed through the texture of daily life. Burckhardt reminded us of something essential, that history is never simply a pile of accumulated events. It is, instead, the ongoing process of human spirit reaching, searching, and exploring. That insight has lost none of its power across the span of time, and it echoes the very spirit that thinker J has always pursued, the conviction that seeing the essence of things matters far more than seeing only their surface. In this ongoing series paying tribute to history great masters, we have walked alongside thinkers who reshaped how humanity sees the natural world, the human mind, and now, with Burckhardt, the very fabric of a civilization. What unites them is not a shared field of study but a shared willingness to look past comfortable assumptions and ask a more demanding question, one that gets closer to the truth of things. Burckhardt asked that question of an entire age and found an answer rich enough to occupy historians for more than a century afterward. Perhaps the deepest lesson he leaves us is not any single fact about the Renaissance, but the patient, attentive habit of mind he brought to everything he studied, a reminder that the most important truths are rarely shouted, but are instead noticed quietly, by someone willing to look closely enough and long enough to see them. That brings us to the end of the story for today. I hope the wisdom of Jacob Burckhardt has given you something new to reflect on. See you next time.